The pact of iron, the mansion rose from the fields like a monument carved out of arrogance. Its pillars gleamed white beneath the sun, but time had already begun its quiet work, etching hairline cracks into the stone, eating at its grandeur like worms through fruit. To the men who built it, the estate was not just a home. It was a throne from which to rule. 5 men had pooled their fortunes, their ambitions, and their vices to create it. Each claimed himself lord, each believed himself master. Yet their unity was sealed not in loyalty but in greed, and the jewel at its center was no piece of land, no harvest, no treasure chest of coins. It was her. She arrived in silence, a figure shrouded in cloth, brought across fields in a wagon as though she were contraband rather than flesh and blood. The men called her a prize, a possession, a bond that would tie them together. She was to be the wife of them all, bound by rings forged of iron instead of gold. Gold, after all, was for love. Iron was for ownership. Each man slid a band onto her finger, swearing to protect her, to keep her, to rule her as one. The pact was unholy from its birth, and yet the witnesses, servants, overseers, a trembling preacher coerced into blessing the arrangement, said nothing. They bowed their heads and turned their eyes away, pretending not to see the violence dressed as ceremony. The 5 lords congratulated themselves, laughing with the self-satisfaction of victors. They drank from silver goblets, their voices echoing across the hall, toasting to their future, to the wealth their estate would bring, to the dominion they would hold. She sat silent at the head of the table, a crown of flowers pressed upon her dark hair, her face a mask of stillness to them. Her silence was obedience. In truth, it was the first thread of her patience being woven into a snare. For in the marrow of her bones she understood something the men did not. Iron rusts. In the weeks that followed, the house came alive with the rituals of control. The 5 masters took turns parading her through the halls, each demanding she address him with the devotion of a bride. They called her their wife, though none treated her as such. To them, she was property, a vessel into which they poured their hunger, their loneliness, their rage. Yet for every command she gave a soft answer. For every cruelty she lowered her gaze. She learned quickly the shape of their desires and mirrored it back like glass, reflecting what each wanted most to see. The eldest among them was called Jonathan, his hair already gone to silver, his voice a rasp from years of tobacco and drink. He fancied himself the patriarch, the one chosen by Providence to lead the others. To him she spoke with respect, feigning awe at his wisdom, letting him believe his trembling hands still commanded reverence. Then there was Thomas, proud and vain, who bathed in perfumes and dressed in silks as though his wealth could make him noble. He craved admiration, hungered for eyes that lingered on him with desire. For him she smiled shyly, let her gaze flicker over him as though he dazzled her, and whispered words that set his heart aflame. Samuel, broad, shouldered and cruel, ruled the fields with the whip. He valued obedience above all else, and so she gave him silence, bowed her head at his approach, and let him think fear had made her docile. Peter, the youngest, was reckless, a man of gambling debts and restless nights. He sought passion in everything, and she gave him laughter, brief touches of her hand, the illusion of shared fire that left him, convinced he alone stirred her spirit. And last was Henry, quiet and watchful, a man who seldom smiled. He was no less possessive, but unlike the others he clung to her with something resembling desperation, as though he feared the very air might steal her away. For him she wove words of comfort, promises of constancy that he devoured like bread. Each man thought himself chosen. Each believed the iron bands on her fingers bound her to him above the others. Yet all the while she watched, she measured their strengths, their weaknesses, the cracks in their armor. And when she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling while the walls of the mansion breathed with the snores and mutterings of men who thought themselves gods, she repeated one vow in silence: iron rusts. Men bleed. The servants spoke of her in whispers. Some pitied her, others feared her. They saw the bruises she concealed beneath long sleeves, the way her smile never reached her eyes. They brought her food with downcast gazes, carried water to her chamber, and lowered their voices when her name passed their lips. They called her the mistress of iron, not for her will, but for the cursed rings she wore. None dared approach her with kindness too openly, for the master's eyes were everywhere, but she listened. She listened when the cook muttered about Samuel's temper, when the stable boy complained of Peter's debts, when the maid wept over Henry's sleepless pacing. Knowledge became her hidden currency, more valuable than coin. Every weakness of the 5 men was stored in her memory, tucked away like a knife beneath cloth. The mansion itself became her teacher. Its halls were lined with portraits of men long dead, their eyes painted to follow intruders. The windows looked out over endless fields where slaves bent their backs under a pitiless sun. At night, the wind pressed against the shutters, rattling them like bones. She walked its corridors with the silence of a ghost, learning which doors creaked, which staircases swallowed footsteps, where shadows lingered long enough to hide in. And always she thought of Chris. Before the mansion, before the pact, before the rings, there had been fields under moonlight and a voice that whispered her name with gentleness. Chris had been the promise of another life, one stolen from her the moment she was dragged behind the walls of iron. His memory was the ember she carried in secret, the one light against the suffocating dark. While the 5 lords clutched her body, she clutched that ember. While they laid claim to her voice, she fed the flame of her silence with his memory. They believed they owned her. They had no idea she was biding her time. The first fracture came quietly, like rot beneath polished wood. Thomas, ever vain, presented her with a necklace of pearls, demanding she wear it before the others as proof of her favor. He wanted them to see that she belonged most to him. She obliged, draping the pearls across her throat, letting them glimmer against her skin. But when Henry entered and saw the necklace, his face hardened. He said nothing, but the silence that settled between the men was heavier than any words. That night, Jonathan raged, accusing Thomas of sowing discord in their brotherhood. Samuel laughed, mocking Henry's jealousy. Peter stoked the fire with drunken jests, suggesting perhaps the pact was flawed if one woman could undo it so easily. Voices rose, wine spilled, and though the quarrel ended without blood, the seed had been planted. She lay in her chamber listening, her face serene in the candlelight. Beneath her pillow, the iron bands cut cold into her skin. She touched them one by one, tracing the circle of each, and whispered to herself the truth no man in that house yet dared speak aloud. The pact was not a bond. It was a curse, and curses always seek their end. Cracks in the pact, the quarrel over the pearls, did not vanish like spilled wine upon the floor. It lingered, staining the air of the mansion. Though the 5 men still dined together, still raised their goblets in hollow toasts, something invisible had shifted. Glances once careless now carried weight. Words once casual were barbed with meaning. The pact sworn in iron had begun to rust. She watched with the patience of a spider in the corner of its web. Each man approached her differently, no longer content to share equally what none truly possessed. They wanted proof, signs of favor, tokens that separated them from their brothers, and she, with steady hands and quiet eyes, gave each man what he most desired, not too much, never too little, enough to keep the fire of jealousy alive. To Jonathan she offered deference. When he lectured at the dinner table, his voice rattling like a dry husk, she leaned forward, nodding as though his wisdom was gospel. He mistook her silence for reverence, and his chest swelled with pride. Yet when Thomas smirked, whispering about Jonathan's failing memory, the old man's hands trembled upon his goblet. To Thomas she gifted her gaze. She let it linger a second longer than necessary, as though unwilling to look away. He boasted afterward that her eyes had chosen him, that she hungered for him above the rest. When Samuel mocked him openly, Thomas only laughed, insisting that mockery was envy in disguise. Samuel, brutal and quick to anger, demanded obedience. To him she gave it, bowing her head whenever his shadow darkened her path. She never resisted his commands, never raised her voice in protest. To Samuel this was victory. Yet behind his back she whispered to Peter, confiding how Samuel's cruelty frightened her. Peter's fists clenched at the thought, his blood quickened, his resolve to protect her growing with every whisper. Peter, reckless in both drink and passion, lived for moments of stolen intimacy. She gave him laughter, light, musical, fleeting. When she brushed her hand against his arm, when she laughed at his drunken tales, he believed he alone touched her soul. But when Henry passed and she quickly withdrew, Peter's drunkenness turned bitter, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Henry required more than comfort, he required constancy. At night, when the others boasted of her, he sought her in silence. She would speak softly of loyalty, of patience, of how she belonged not to the loudest man, but to the truest. He devoured her words as though they were water in drought. Yet when he saw the pearls glittering once more at her throat, the doubt returned, poisoning his thoughts like venom. 5 men, 1 woman, and between them threads pulled taut, straining toward inevitable rupture. The mansion itself began to groan beneath the weight of discord. Servants moved carefully, fearful of their master's tempers. Meals were served in silence, plates set down without a word. The air smelled faintly of ash, though no fire burned. Hallways echoed differently, as though the house itself had become hollow, waiting for screams. Rumors spread among the slaves who toiled in the fields. They said the pact was cursed, that no house built upon a stolen soul could prosper. They spoke of the ring's iron bands that bound not only her fingers, but the lives of the 5 men who wore their own copies upon their hands. Iron, they murmured, attracts rust and blood. Sooner or later, both would come. She listened, always listening, her silence sharper than knives. In her chamber she traced the rings upon her hand. Heavy things, crude compared to the finery of gold, their weight reminded her of shackles. Yet she had learned long ago that shackles can be broken, and even chains can become weapons. The second fracture came with fire. One evening, while the men feasted, voices rising in drunken boasts, a scream split the air outside. A servant rushed in, breathless, stammering that the barn was ablaze. Samuel rose at once, rage flashing in his eyes. He accused Peter of neglect, of leaving lanterns burning. Peter leapt to his feet, fists clenched, insisting Samuel had whipped the slaves so mercilessly they had set the blaze themselves in revenge. The others joined in Jonathan muttering that Samuel's cruelty endangered them all, Thomas mocking Peter's incompetence. Voices thundered, fists slammed upon the table, goblets spilled crimson wine across white linen like blood. Through it all she sat still, her eyes lowered, her hands folded. When at last Henry turned to her, demanding she speak, she raised her gaze slowly. Her voice was soft, trembling as though the very thought of the fire frightened her. Perhaps, she whispered, the barn was no accident. Perhaps the land itself resents the pact. The men fell silent, their anger momentarily stilled. Her words slid into their ears like poison, subtle and slow, planting doubt not in each other, but in the foundation of the vow itself. That night Jonathan sought her in her chamber. His face was pale, his eyes sunken with unease. He sat at the edge of her bed, clutching his iron ring as though it burned his hand. "You believe the pact cursed?" he asked, voice quivering. She lowered her gaze, allowing silence to stretch, then lifted her eyes with practiced sorrow. "I believe," she said softly, "that vows made with iron weigh heavier than vows made with love, and iron always rusts, my lord." He shuddered, gripping her hand. "But you are mine, aren't you? You see me as your true husband." Her lips curved in the faintest smile, tender yet elusive. "You are the one who gave me wisdom," she murmured. "If the pact breaks, you will remain." Jonathan left her chamber with pride in his chest and terror in his veins. The seed had sprouted. The following days deepened the fractures. Peter, still drunk on both wine and jealousy, cornered her in the garden. His voice slurred, his breath thick with drink. "Tell me," he demanded, gripping her arm, "do you love me above them all? Say it, and I will take you away. Tonight, if need be." Her eyes filled with tears, tears she summoned at will, glittering in candlelight. "You know my heart," she whispered, "but if we flee, they will hunt us both. Patience, Peter. Wait for the moment when their eyes are turned against each other. Then we will be free." His grip loosened. He staggered back, muttering oaths, his desire inflamed by hope. She watched him stumble away, her tears vanishing as quickly as they had come. The third fracture came with death, though not yet one of the masters. A servant, accused by Samuel of negligence during the fire, was whipped until flesh hung in strips from his back. The man died by morning, his body buried without prayer in the far fields. Whispers spread like wildfire, that the death was an omen, that the curse had claimed its first blood. The men argued over responsibility, voices raw with fury. Samuel blamed Peter for his mockery. Peter blamed Jonathan for weakness. Jonathan accused Thomas of vanity. Thomas sneered at Henry's silence. Henry, eyes burning with quiet madness, turned not against his brothers but against her, demanding reassurance. "You are mine, aren't you?" He whispered fiercely in her ear, "Say it." She cupped his face with gentle hands, her eyes steady. "I belong to no one but you." And once more the seed sprouted. The mansion grew darker with every passing night. The portraits on the walls seemed to scowl. The shutters rattled, though no wind blew. Servants crossed themselves when her name was spoken, whispering that she walked like a ghost even while alive. And she, clothed in patience, smiled faintly at the men who fought for her. She had given them the illusion of choice, of triumph, of favor. In truth, she held the reins of their madness. Iron rusts, men bleed. The curse was only beginning to feed. The first grave the storm had been building for weeks, though the skies remained clear. It brewed not in the heavens, but within the mansion's walls, a suffocating pressure that no prayer or oath could relieve. The 5 men who had once sworn unity over her body now sat at table as rivals. Their laughter was brittle, their words poisoned, and she silent, watchful, was the storm's eye. The quarrel began over nothing more than a pearl. A strand of them lay upon her throat, the very necklace that had once driven Peter to rage. Samuel, his temper ever ready, accused Jonathan of favoring her with gifts beyond the pact's decree. Jonathan, affronted, denied the charge, yet his denial came too quickly, too heated, betraying guilt in its very vehemence. Peter, drunk and flushed, slammed his goblet against the table. Wine spilled like blood across the cloth. "She should be mine outright," he slurred. "We waste our lives pretending at brotherhood while she—" Henry's hand shot out, gripping Peter's wrist with iron force. "Watch your tongue," he growled, his voice low with barely restrained fury. "She belongs to us all, equally," Peter sneered, wrenching free. "Equally, you believe she whispers the same to you as to me? Fool! She has chosen, though she dares not say." His eyes darted to her, pleading, demanding. She lowered her gaze, a tremor of breath escaping her lips, just enough. The men saw what they wished to see. The argument festered through the night. By the hour of midnight, goblets lay overturned, food lay untouched, and the 5 men had splintered into factions of accusation and denial. She slipped quietly from the hall, her departure unmarked amidst the din. In her chamber she waited, hands folded in her lap, the iron rings cold against her skin. When the first scream tore through the mansion, she did not flinch. It was Peter. Servants later whispered what they saw. Peter staggering through the corridor, face red with drink, eyes wild with rage. Samuel followed, blade drawn, his voice thundering with threats. The quarrel, begun at table, had spilled into violence. She appeared then, stepping into the hall as though drawn by fate. Her presence silenced both men, if only for a moment. Samuel snarled, pointing his knife, "He boasts of stealing you away. Say it is false. Swear it before God and men." Her eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling. She turned slowly to Peter. "Did you boast such things?" Peter's breath caught. He saw the plea in her gaze, or thought he did. His drunken courage faltered, then flared again. "I did, and I meant it. You love me, not them. Say it now, before them all." Her tears spilled. She shook her head, silent. Samuel roared. The blade flashed in lamplight. Steel met flesh with a sickening sound. Peter gasped, clutching at his belly as blood welled between his fingers. His knees buckled, his body collapsing at her feet. His eyes, wide with disbelief, sought hers one last time. "You," he croaked, but the word died with him. She knelt, her face etched with grief so perfect it seemed carved from stone. She pressed a hand to his cheek, whispering, "Forgive me." To Samuel it looked like sorrow. To Peter it was the last vision he carried into the grave. The mansion reeled with the news. Jonathan muttered of curses fulfilled. Henry stalked the halls, demanding justice. Thomas scoffed, calling Peter a fool undone by drink. Samuel, flushed with both guilt and triumph, declared that he had defended their pact from betrayal. None dared question her. The body was buried at dawn. No priest was called. No prayers were spoken. The earth swallowed Peter quietly, the first offering to the curse whispered by slaves. In the fields they crossed themselves, murmuring that the ground would drink more blood before peace returned. The atmosphere thickened. The halls groaned at night, doors creaked though no hand touched them. The portraits of past masters seemed to glare, their painted eyes accusing. Servants moved like shadows, unwilling to meet her gaze. Rumor spread that she walked at night barefoot, her white gown trailing like a shroud, her face pale as the moon. Some swore they heard her voice in empty corridors, whispering names not their own, and the men, once bound in unity, now circled each other like wolves. Jonathan sought her counsel. In his study, surrounded by ledgers and books, he clutched her hands. "The pact is broken," he whispered. "Samuel has shed blood. We are damned." She bowed her head, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps it is not the pact that is broken, but the men who swore it." He stared at her, pale as parchment. "Then tell me, who is true among us?" She lifted her eyes, their depths unreadable. "The one who waits, not the one who seizes." Jonathan left her chamber trembling, convinced he alone bore the patience she praised. Meanwhile, Samuel grew bolder. He strutted through the halls, blade always near at hand, daring the others to challenge him. "She is mine," he declared, loud enough for the walls to hear. "The rest of you may play at husband, but she knows who defends her honor." Henry's silence deepened. His eyes burned with feverish devotion. To her he whispered prayers, vows of protection, promises of eternity. She listened, her face composed, her responses soft as lullabies. To Samuel she gave obedience, to Jonathan reverence, to Thomas indulgent smiles. Each man received his portion. Each believed himself chosen, and the mansion fed upon their delusion. At night, when all slept, she sat by the window. The iron rings gleamed faintly in candlelight, their weight pressing into her skin. 1 ring, 5 masters. Already the balance was broken. 4 remained, and she knew with the certainty of the condemned that the earth would not be satisfied with a single grave. She whispered a name into the dark. Not Jonathan, nor Samuel, nor Henry, nor Thomas. A different name, one longed for, one remembered. Chris. Her breath fogged the glass, the candle guttered. In the silence of the sleeping house, she smiled faintly. The storm had broken. The pact had begun to devour itself. The second offering the earth had not yet dried over Peter's grave before the mansion began to rot from within. His absence lingered in every chamber, not as grief, but as warning. The pact had drawn first blood, and the house itself seemed to thirst for more. It was Samuel who carried himself as victor, his blade sharpened, his steps heavy with swagger. "I defended her," he boasted in the great hall, goblet raised high. "I alone had the courage to strike. While you wrung your hands and stammered, I acted." Thomas sneered, lounging in his chair. "Defended? You gutted a drunkard in his cups. No valor in slaying a stumbling fool." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he laughed instead, a short bark that echoed against the walls. "Say what you will, Thomas. She knows who keeps her safe. She chooses me." At that, all eyes turned to her. She sat near the fire, needle poised over fabric, her face composed. She did not lift her gaze, yet her cheeks colored faintly, her breath catching ever so slightly, just enough for Samuel to see what he desired. His grin widened. Jonathan's hands trembled where they gripped the arms of his chair. Henry's lips moved in silent prayer. Thomas's smile curled, cruel and knowing. The air was a wire drawn taut. The servants felt it most keenly. They whispered in corners, their eyes darting to the staircase, to her chamber door. Old Martha, the cook, swore she heard footsteps pacing above her kitchen each night, though all the masters were below. The younger maids refused to enter her chamber alone, claiming the air within pressed heavy on their lungs, as though another presence lay in wait. In the fields, the enslaved crossed themselves when the bell tolled. The curse is awake. One muttered, "One by one, it will take them all." Jonathan could bear it no longer. He sought her out one dusk, when the house lay in uneasy quiet. She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair, the candlelight catching strands like threads of gold. "Tell me," he whispered, voice thick with desperation, "tell me I am the one. Do not torment me with silence." Her hand stilled upon the brush. In the mirror she met his eyes, his pale, hollow eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. "You are patient," she murmured, her voice like balm. Patience is the truest proof of love. Jonathan's breath caught. He sank to his knees beside her, clutching her gown. Then say it, say I am chosen. She laid a trembling hand upon his hair. The day will come when patience is rewarded. Until then, trust. His body shook with silent sobs. She watched him, her face a mask of sorrow, and behind her eyes calculation burned like a hidden flame. Samuel, drunk on his certainty, pressed further. He cornered her in the gallery one night, hand braced against the wall. "Enough of pretense," he growled, his breath reeking of wine. "You wear my protection, you owe me your devotion. Swear it now before the portraits of their dead fathers." Her lips parted. She drew back slightly as if in fear and whispered, "Not here, they watch us." His gaze flicked to the painted ancestors glaring down from their frames, then softened with lust and pride. He caught her wrist, pressing a kiss against the iron ring that bound her. Soon, he promised, "I will make you mine, wholly and without division." She lowered her eyes. "If it is meant, none may stop you." He left, satisfied. She remained in the gallery, alone beneath the painted eyes. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass covering each portrait. A woman bound, surrounded by men who believed themselves masters. She whispered, so softly it was nearly prayer, "One more." It came sooner than even she had expected. The quarrel broke like a thunderclap. "Thomas, ever the cynic," taunted Samuel openly at supper. "Our Lady smiles upon us all," he said, raising his goblet. "Yet you strut as though she beds only you. Tell me, Samuel, does she whisper your name, or do you only imagine it when wine clouds your head?" Samuel roared, overturning the table in his fury. Dishes shattered, candles guttered, servants fled shrieking. He lunged for Thomas, fists clenched, but Thomas was quicker. He seized the carving knife from the board, steel gleaming in lamplight. "Come then," he spat. "Let us see which of us she favors when blood stains the floor." The clash was brutal, graceless. Fists, steel, curses. Jonathan cowered against the wall, pale with terror. Henry clutched a crucifix to his breast, whispering frenzied prayers. She sat motionless, hands folded, watching with eyes wide and glistening, a picture of helpless horror, until Samuel faltered. His foot slipped upon spilled wine, his balance broken. In that instant Thomas struck. The knife drove deep, just beneath the ribs. Samuel's roar turned to a wet gasp. His eyes bulged, his body stiffened. Slowly he staggered, clutching the wound, blood pouring between his fingers. She rose then, rushing to him with a cry so mournful it chilled the marrow of all who heard it. She caught him as he fell, her gown soaking in his blood. His eyes locked on hers, desperate, pleading. "You," he rasped. "Hush." She whispered, stroking his cheek with tender fingers. "You defended me. Rest now." His breath rattled once, twice, then ceased. The second grave was dug before dawn. The mansion reeled again. Thomas claimed victory, boasting that Samuel had overreached. Jonathan retched in corners, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Henry grew more frantic, scribbling psalms in the margins of ledgers, his hands ink-stained and trembling. And she walked the halls in silence, her face pale, her hands ever clasped at her breast. To some she was grief incarnate, to others a saint of endurance. Yet at night, when all slept, she pressed her lips to the iron rings, whispering names in the dark. The pact had thinned, 5 had sworn, 3 remained, and the house waited hungry. The anatomy of inheritance, the air in the mansion, grew stagnant after Samuel's death, as though the walls themselves refused to breathe. The scent of iron and rot lingered in every corridor, though the servants scrubbed and scrubbed until their hands bled. 2 graves now marred the earth near the orchard, and whispers in the fields spoke of a third already waiting. Yet inside, her body became the new battleground. It was Jonathan who first raised the matter, voice quivering as he addressed the others in the library. "We must consult a physician," he said, his eyes darting from Thomas's scowl to Henry's pale devotion. "The pact was not merely for her hand, but for her womb. The inheritance, our name, must not perish with us." Henry pressed trembling fingers to his lips, as though swallowing a curse. "Do not speak of her thus. She is no vessel." Yet even as he said it, his gaze flicked toward her belly, where her hands rested lightly in her lap. Thomas snorted, tossing back his brandy. At last sense prevails. The pact was for possession and posterity. If she cannot carry, then all this blood has been spilled for nothing. She sat at the edge of the firelight, face composed, eyes lowered. The men argued above her head as though she were an object, a ledger to be balanced. Inside, her heart pounded steady as a drum. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it. The physician arrived within a fortnight. His name, preserved in the margins of a parish register, was Dr. Elias Corbin, a man of 50 years, with spectacles perched upon his nose and hands perpetually ink-stained from his notes. He carried with him a leather case of instruments, forceps, calipers, a stethoscope of polished wood, and vials of ether that glimmered like captured moonlight. He bowed stiffly upon entering her chamber. "Gentlemen," he intoned, though his eyes lingered on her with a curiosity that unsettled, "I am told the matter is of heredity." Jonathan produced a ledger, trembling as he spoke. "We require certainty. She must be examined, her health, her capacity." Henry recoiled. "This is indecency," he cried, clutching his crucifix. "You would lay her bare before strangers." Thomas sneered. "Better bare than barren. Let the man do his work." Her gaze lifted then, calm and unblinking. "If it will ease your doubts, let it be done." The words silenced them all. The examination took place in her chamber, the men dismissed to the hall while Dr. Corbin conducted his work. His journal survives only in fragments, copied in a later hand, stamped property of the Society for Medical Inquiry, 1842. The entries are terse yet chilling, pulse regular, constitution sound, skin pallid with curious coolness of extremities. Abdomen unremarkable, pelvis examined with calipers, measurements recorded herein redacted, ovaries palpated with unusual firmness, suspect anomaly of hereditary nature, further study recommended. One note, nearly illegible, reads simply, "Eyes unusually steady resisted ether with unnatural calm." When he emerged, Dr. Corbin adjusted his spectacles and delivered his judgment. "She is fit, her body is sound," yet he hesitated, glancing toward her door. "There are peculiarities, hardenings where there should be softness, a resistance of nerves uncommon in her sex. It may signify nothing, or it may signify much." Jonathan paled much. Dr. Corbin folded his hands. "I cannot yet say. It may be hereditary." At that word the room stiffened. Hereditary, the curse whispered among the slaves, the madness muttered in ledgers of the family line. The word clung to them like mildew, unseen yet suffocating. That night Jonathan pored over genealogical folios, tracing the lines of kin and cousin. He marked notes in the margins, fevers that carried infants, twins born still, women struck with seizures in childbirth. Patterns, he muttered, candlelight flickering across his face. Always the women, always the womb. Henry knelt in the chapel, whispering psalms until his lips bled, begging heaven to cleanse her blood of taint. Thomas, meanwhile, grew only more resolute. "If she carries strange flesh, then so be it. Strange flesh may yet carry my name." And she sat before her mirror, brushing her hair until it gleamed. In the reflection she did not see herself but the ring of iron on her finger, 5 rings, 2 already meaningless. She whispered again the name no one else heard, Chris. Dr. Corbin returned twice more, summoned under pretense of further inquiry. His instruments gleamed sharper each visit. Once he held a bone saw up to the lamplight, murmuring of the pelvis as a cage to be measured. Another time he sketched her profile in the margin of his journal, noting the symmetry of skull, the width of brow. "Your lineage may be rare," he said softly as though to himself, "a specimen, preserved by circumstance." She smiled faintly, though her eyes burned cold. "Specimens are collected," she replied, "not kept." His hand trembled as he closed his case. But the examinations kindled fire among the men. Jonathan accused Thomas of bribing the physician to falsify notes. Henry declared that every measurement was a trespass against God. Thomas taunted them both, claiming he alone would plant his seed in soil proven fertile by science. At supper, their words flared into shouting. Plates shattered, silverware clattered. She sat quietly as the storm raged, her hands folded, the faintest smile playing at her lips. For she knew the truth. They were no longer bound to her by passion, but by science. Each man feared being erased, Each man clung to her body as though it were parchment upon which his name might be written, and in their fear they grew careless. The journals of Dr. Corbin end abruptly. His final note, smudged with ink and stamped confidential, reads, "Her blood bears a strangeness I cannot classify. The corpuscles appear, altered, a degeneration or an evolution. Further specimens required." The next page is torn out. That very night, the physician vanished from the house. Some said he fled in terror, carrying with him sketches and measurements that might have ruined the family name. Others swore he did not leave at all, that he lies still within those walls, hidden in some forgotten cavity, his bones gnawed clean. Whatever the truth, he was never seen again, and the men, left without science to steady them, turned back to their oldest weapons, suspicion, jealousy, and rage. 3 remained. The pact was rotting, and she, calm as a statue, waited for the next fracture. Psalms for the damned, the storm of Dr. Corbin's disappearance left the house cloaked in dread. By dawn, the servants whispered that his carriage had never reached the village. Others swore they heard a muffled cry in the night, then silence. Whatever truth clung to the walls was never spoken, for none dared admit aloud what they suspected, that the house itself had swallowed him. 3 men remained bound to the pact, each frayed by fear. The brothers had begun to avoid one another, drifting like shadows through the mansion's corridors, their boots echoing against cold stone. Only in her presence did they gather, drawn as moths to a flame they could neither quench nor control, and she, calm, radiant, unshaken, let their silence grow sharp as a blade. Henry's prayers became more desperate with each passing night. He had taken to the small chapel built by their father, where plaster saints sagged under years of mildew. By candlelight he knelt upon the hard floor, chanting psalms until his lips cracked. "Cleanse her blood," he whispered, forehead pressed to the altar. "Purge the taint, spare our line the curse of Cain." The servants reported him muttering in Latin, though his education in the tongue had been meager. Once, in a fit of ecstasy, he slashed his palm with a shard of glass, letting the blood drip onto the crucifix. The red ran over the white marble Christ like a wound renewed, staining it indelibly. She found him there one evening, his face hollow, his hand still bleeding. "You cannot pray curses away," she said softly. His eyes lifted to hers, fever, bright. "But you are the vessel of both sin and salvation. If I sanctify you, if I purify the line, then heaven will bless us." Her lips curved in something like pity. "Do you think heaven watches this house?" His sob choked the chapel air. Meanwhile, Jonathan buried himself in archives. The library became his cloister, parchment his scripture. He traced the family's genealogy back through brittle registers and half-burned folios. His notes grew wild, pages covered in branching diagrams, arrows stabbing from cousin to cousin. "See," he hissed one evening, slamming his palm upon the table as Thomas entered. "The curse lies in our women, stillbirths, seizures, madness over and over, across generations. It is the womb that carries rot." Thomas sneered, pouring himself wine. "Then better she be my womb than yours. What is cursed in your hand may yet bear fruit in mine." Jonathan's face twisted, veins standing at his temples. He spat words too vile to repeat, then collapsed into laughter so jagged it rattled the shutters. From that night forward, his sanity began to fray. Thomas, unlike the others, had abandoned all pretense of sanctity or study. To him, she was possession, plain and simple. "Science is gone, faith is madness," he declared, voice booming through the hall. "What remains is will, and my will shall master her." He began to follow her through the mansion like a hound. When she sat to embroider, he loomed in the doorway. When she took her supper, he lingered behind her chair. Once, in the moonlight, she woke to find him standing at her bedside, his breath ragged, his hand hovering above her shoulder. She did not flinch. She only looked at him, calm, unblinking. "You may touch the chain," she whispered, "but never the soul." The words chilled him more than a blade. He retreated, muttering, but the hunger in his eyes only deepened. The servants, too, felt the house tightening. They moved with bowed heads, carrying trays as though into a mausoleum. Some fled in the night, abandoning their posts without pay. Those who remained whispered that the mistress walked the halls with eyes that never blinked, a spectre bound in flesh. Marginal notes from a surviving steward's ledger, later preserved in an archive, record the unease. Oct. 17. Candles burned to stubs, though none light them. Singing from chapel heard, though Master Henry alone prays. Mistress walks at night. Her shadow lingers after she passes. Rings upon her hand glimmer, though no fire touches them. The third death came swiftly. It was Jonathan, undone by the very knowledge he sought. His research into the family line grew rabid. He stopped sleeping, muttering of tainted corpuscles and ancestral degeneracy. One morning, the servants found him in the library, ink spattered across his hands, a scalpel lying beside him. His forearms bore shallow cuts where he had tried to bleed himself of corruption. When Thomas dragged him upright, Jonathan screamed, "It is in the blood. It is in her blood, and now in mine." Henry rushed in, crossing himself furiously, crying psalms. In the chaos, Jonathan snatched the scalpel and lunged. Not at Thomas, not at Henry, but at her. His hand shook. His eyes bulged, spittle frothed at his lips. Better she die than bear the curse. He shrieked, but Thomas was faster. His blade flashed, plunging into Jonathan's ribs. The younger brother gasped, dropped the scalpel, and fell against the bookcase. The shelves shuddered, spilling genealogical folios across his collapsing body. His blood spread across the diagrams he had drawn, blotting out the names he had circled. A cruel symmetry, the scholar drowned by his own obsession. Jonathan died with curses on his lips, eyes fixed not on his brothers but on her. That night Henry collapsed before the chapel altar, sobbing, "Lord, forgive us." He begged, "The pact is broken, the blood is cursed, deliver us from her." Thomas stood at the head of the dining table, goblet in hand, unrepentant. "3 remain," he muttered, "and I am stronger for it." She sat in silence, the third ring added to the pouch she kept hidden in her chamber. The iron bands clinked softly like shackles or trophies, each one heavier, each one closer to completion. The house groaned in the wind, the graves in the orchard swelled with new earth. 3 masters had fallen. 2 remained, and she, calm as marble, waited. The blood salter the orchard lay swollen with 3 graves now, each mound damp with autumn rain. The earth seemed restless, as though unable to contain what had been buried. The servants avoided the trees, whispering that roots grew twisted there as if drunk on blood. Inside the mansion, silence spread like mildew. Jonathan's screams lingered in memory, echoing faintly down stone corridors. Only 2 masters remained, and both clung to her as though she were the axis of their fate. Yet their devotion took different forms, Henry in prayer and Thomas in possession, and she, calm as ever, let them circle like wolves snapping at one another's throats. Henry no longer prayed for himself but for her. The chapel glowed each night with candlelight, his voice rising hoarse and cracked. He dragged her into the sanctuary once, insisting she kneel beside him. "Your blood must be cleansed," he whispered feverishly. Corbin was right. It is hereditary, but prayer can scourge even taint. Say the psalm with me. She lowered her eyes, hands folded, though her lips did not move. "Say it," he cried, seizing her wrist so tightly the bone ached. Her voice came at last, quiet, deliberate. "Deliver us from evil." The words steadied him, though she spoke them not as plea but as judgment. He did not hear the difference. Thomas, meanwhile, grew bolder. He began locking her chamber door from the outside, declaring it for protection. He ate only at her side, drank only when she lifted her cup. When she walked the halls, his footsteps followed. Jonathan was weak. He told her one night, his breath hot against her cheek. "Henry is mad, but I am strong. I will keep you. I will give you sons." She tilted her head, eyes calm, voice smooth as oil. "Yes, you are strong." The flattery was poison, but he drank it as wine. Henry's mania deepened after that. He began fasting, hollowing himself with hunger. His cheeks sank, his eyes burned fever, bright. One evening he appeared in the dining hall with a bundle clutched to his chest. He unwrapped it slowly, a Bible, its margins filled with cramped handwriting, verses rewritten into invocations. "This is my psalter," he announced, voice trembling. "It is written in blood, mine and hers." Thomas laughed. "You cut yourself like Jonathan, fool." Henry's hand shook as he opened the pages. Indeed, crimson blotches marked the parchment, ink mingled with dried gore. "Not mine alone," he whispered. "She bled too, and so the scripture is sealed." Her gaze did not waver. She remembered well the drop he had stolen from her finger after pricking her with a pin during prayer. He thought it sacred. She had allowed it, knowing how deep the madness would run. That night Henry burst into her chamber while died clutching the psalter. "We must consummate," he said, shaking, "not as they would have it, but as sanctification. The blood will be cleansed in holy union." Thomas struck him across the face, sending him sprawling. "You'll not touch her, priest," he growled. The two men grappled in the hall, their voices echoing through the mansion like beasts in a cage. She stood in the doorway, calm, silent, watching. At last Thomas pinned Henry against the wall, dagger pressed to his throat. "Cross me again, and you'll join the orchard," he spat. Henry laughed then, wild and broken. "It is not you she belongs to, it is God, and he will take her from you as he has taken the rest." The words rattled Thomas, though he hid it beneath rage. He released his brother with a shove, storming away. Henry slid down the wall, cradling his psalter, whispering through bloodied lips, "Sanctified in suffering, sanctified in blood." The servants could not endure it. Several fled that night, slipping into the fields beneath cover of darkness. Those who remained began recording strange occurrences in their ledgers. Nov. 3. Mistress passes through locked doors. How, we cannot say. Candles snuff when Thomas raises his voice. Henry seen weeping blood, eyes red as fire. Rings upon her hand burn to the touch. None dare approach. The house was becoming a reliquary of dread, each room marked by obsession, each wall steeped in curses unspoken. The fourth death came in winter's first frost. Henry, gaunt and hollow, stood once more at the altar. He raised the psalter high, chanting verses so corrupted they no longer resembled scripture. His voice cracked as he cried, "Cleanse her womb, O Lord, let her bear sons free of the serpent's coil." Thomas entered behind him, drunk on wine and fury. "You shame us all," he snarled, dagger glinting in hand. "You shame her, you shame the pact, enough." Henry turned, eyes blazing. "Strike me, and my blood will cry from the ground against you." But Thomas did not hesitate. The blade plunged into Henry's chest, piercing bone with a crack like splitting wood. He gasped, clutched the psalter to his breast, and fell across the altar. His blood spilled over the crucifix, mingling with wax and ash. The chapel stank of iron and incense, of faith corrupted into murder. She entered quietly, her face pale in the candlelight. She crossed herself with measured calm, stepped to the altar, and pried the ring from Henry's stiffening finger. Thomas stared at her, breath heaving, dagger dripping. "Do you mourn him?" She met his gaze without fear. "No, I release him." The words froze him, though he could not name why. 4 rings now lay in her pouch, their iron clinking like chains forged in hell. Only one remained. The orchard waited for its 4th grave. The mansion groaned in the frost. The servants whispered that the mistress was not mortal but revenant, collecting rings as toll for the afterlife. And she, calm as ever, folded her hands, eyes steady, and prepared for the final act. The last clement winter clamped its jaws upon the countryside, sealing roads in ice and muffling the world beneath snow. The estate lay in dreadful stillness, its halls lined with frost, its windows rattling with the wind's thin fingers. Where once 5 voices thundered, now only Thomas remained, and she. The orchard behind the house had become a charnel ground, 4 graves in crooked line, each marked by a crude wooden cross, snow heaped upon the mounds like burial shrouds. The servants avoided the sight, whispering that when the wind howled through the branches, it carried the groans of the dead. And still, she walked the house unshaken, her steps measured, her gaze steady. Thomas grew gaunt, yet feverishly alive, as if consuming himself from within. He slept little, prowling the corridors with a candle in one hand and a pistol in the other. The mansion was his kingdom now, and he ruled it with paranoia. "She is mine," he muttered, pacing before the hearth. "Mine by strength, mine by blood." Right, the others were weak. Henry with his psalms, Jonathan with his shame, Elias with his trembling. Fools, all of them, I remain. She sat opposite him, silent, her hands folded over her lap. The firelight made her skin glow, her calmness more terrible than any outburst. "Yes," she said softly, "you remain." The words fed him like meat thrown to a starving hound. Yet outside his reach, his authority frayed. More servants fled, vanishing into the snow. their absences marked only by open doors and footprints trailing into the night. Those who stayed dared not enter her chamber, nor even look at her too long. One record survives in the steward's ledger, Deck 12. Only 6 of us remain. The master raves. The mistress speaks little, but her eyes command. 4 rings upon her chain, 1 hand unclaimed. We fear what happens when she takes the last. No sleep? House feels watched. Rumors crept beyond the estate. Parish records mention strange cries carried on the winter air, and lights in the orchard at unholy hours. Some claim to see her at the window, veiled in frost, gazing down upon the village as if surveying subjects. Others swore they heard a woman's voice whisper their names in the night. Thomas clung to her with desperation disguised as authority. He kept her chamber locked, but she never seemed disturbed by the confinement. Each morning she appeared at his side in the dining hall as though she had willed the door open herself. One night he confessed, voice raw, "They said you would destroy us, but I have outlasted them. You will give me sons, and through them my name will endure. You are my salvation." She looked at him with an expression unreadable, then answered, "Yes, endure." The word chilled him, though he knew not why. The mansion itself began to unravel. Doors warped in the frost, beams groaned, and plaster fell in pale flakes. Rats skittered through the halls, gnawing at forgotten grain. The air carried a perpetual odor of iron, candle wax, and rot. The orchard graves grew restless beneath the snow. On storm nights the crosses shuddered as if shaken by unseen hands. Thomas, half mad with fear of losing her, dragged her to the orchard once. "See them," he hissed, "all gone, but I live, I stand, you cannot deny me." She gazed upon the mounds, her breath rising pale in the air. "Yes," she murmured, "you stand." The words sounded less like praise than pronouncement, and his heart faltered. The servants recorded their final note shortly after. Deck 28. Only 3 of us remain. Mistress walks in snow without leaving prints. Master raves, speaks to shadows. We will not last the winter. No further entries followed. On the year's last night, Thomas gathered what remained of his strength. He adorned the dining hall with candles, set a banquet for 2 upon the long oak table, though much of the food had spoiled. He dressed in black velvet, the garb of authority, though his cheeks were sunken and his eyes fever bright. When she entered, he rose to meet her, voice trembling with both command and plea. "Tonight it ends, no more waiting, no more games. You are mine by conquest, by blood, by right. You will bear my name, and none shall defy it." She regarded him coolly, then sat at the table. If it must end, let it end. The words should have satisfied him, yet dread coiled in his gut. He poured wine, his hand shaking, spilling crimson across the linen. The liquid spread like blood across snow. He raised his glass in toast to us. He whispered. She lifted her cup, though she did not drink, her eyes fixed upon him, steady, unblinking. He felt as though her gaze hollowed him out, leaving him a shell. His voice cracked. "Say it. Say you are mine." At last she spoke, her tone soft, final. "No, I am my own." The words struck him harder than any blade. He staggered back, the glass slipping from his hand, shattering upon the floor. In that instant he understood. All his strength, all his blood. Right, all his violence had been for nothing. She had never belonged to him, nor to any of them, and in her pouch 4 rings waited for their 5th. The house moaned in the storm, its timbers straining as if under a colossal weight. Candles guttered, shadows lunged across the walls. Thomas stumbled from the hall, roaring like a wounded beast. She did not follow. She merely sat, hands folded, eyes calm, listening as the last master raged through the corridors, his voice dwindling into hoarse echoes. By dawn his footsteps had ceased, and she remained. The 5th ring the storm did not abate. Through the night, wind lashed the shutters and drove snow into the chimneys. The mansion shook like a vessel adrift, timbers groaning under winter's wrath. In the upper chambers, Thomas prowled like a cornered beast. His velvet coat was torn, his dagger still wet with spilled wine. Shadows flitted before his eyes, and in every mirror he saw not his own face, but those of his brothers, accusing, jeering, promising vengeance. He shouted to the walls, "I am master here, I alone endure." but no echo came, only silence, thick and suffocating. She waited in her chamber, composed as though preparing for vespers. The storm rattled the panes, yet her candle burned steady. The pouch of rings lay upon the table, its contents clinking softly when she touched them, as though restless for completion. At last the door burst inward. Thomas staggered in, while, dyed hair plastered with sweat, dagger raised. "You will not deny me," he growled. "Not after all I've done, all I've borne. They fell because they were weak, but I am strong. You will be mine if I must carve it into your flesh." She rose slowly, meeting his frenzy with calm. "You are already carved, Thomas. Every wound, every fear, you are hollow." His hand trembled, the dagger wavering. "Do not mock me." "I do not mock," she said, stepping closer. "I judge." He lunged. The blade struck the table instead, shattering wood, splintering the pouch. The 4 rings spilled across the floor, ringing like bells of doom. Thomas froze, staring at them. His brother's tokens glinted in the candle, light Elias's, William's, Jonathan's, Henry's, all that remained of them, save the graves in the orchard. "No," he whispered, "not theirs, not me." She bent and gathered the rings, one by one, her movements deliberate, her fingers brushing the iron with reverence. Then she stood before him, palm open. Only one remains. He recoiled, as though the rings themselves had cursed him. Yet pride, that fatal marrow of his bones, compelled him forward. He pressed the dagger to her throat, voice breaking. "Swear it now, where you are mine, or I will cut you where you stand." She did not flinch. Her eyes, steady as ever, reflected the wavering candlelight. "I am not yours. I was never theirs. I am my own." The words rang like a psalm, pure and terrible. Thomas screamed, thrusting the blade downward. But her hand was quicker. She seized his wrist, turned the dagger with sudden strength, and drove it into his own chest. His eyes widened in shock, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. Blood spilled hot against her hands, staining her gown. He staggered, gasping, clutching at the wound. "You," he choked. "You," but no further words came. He collapsed at her feet, the dagger buried to the hilt, blood pooling across the floorboards. She bent, calm as always, and slid the final ring from his stiffening hand. 5 rings now lay upon her palm, glinting like stars fallen from heaven. She closed her fingers over them, her expression unreadable. The mansion groaned, as if the house itself understood its line was ended. Shutters slammed open, snow gusted in, extinguishing the candles. Darkness swallowed the room save for the faint glow of dawn filtering through torn curtains. She stood alone in the silence, the storm fading beyond the windows. Only the slow drip of Thomas's blood marked the passing of time. When the servants crept back at sunrise, they found the mistress seated in her chair, pale but unshaken, the body of their master at her feet. She did not weep, nor did she smile. "Bury him," she said simply, and so they carried Thomas to the orchard, laying him in the last grave beside his brothers. Snow fell thick upon the crosses, 5 in a row, the orchard now a testament to folly and blood. She watched the burial with stillness, her hand resting upon the pouch at her side. When the earth closed over him, she turned back toward the house, her shadow stretching long in the winter light. That night the surviving servants heard the clink of iron in her chamber, as if the rings were being counted, polished, arranged. They swore they heard whispers too, words not in any tongue they knew, spoken softly, reverently, like a priestess before an altar. By morning the servants were gone, vanished without farewell, doors left open, beds cold. Some say they fled in terror, unwilling to dwell in a house now ruled by her alone. Others whisper they were taken, claimed by whatever pact she had sealed. Only she remained, mistress of the mansion, the orchard, the 5 graves, and the rings. The rings and the road. The mansion was silent, where once the corridors trembled beneath the weight of 5 men's voices, commanding, quarreling, boasting. There now lingered only the hush of dust. Curtains sagged heavy with mildew, their folds unmoved by any living breath. In the dining hall goblets remained overturned, their rims darkened with dried wine and darker stains. The hearths were cold, the instruments of rule. Ledgers, seals, iron keys, scattered and useless. It was not merely a house bereft of masters. It was a sepulchre, its stones steeped in betrayal and murder. The servants crossed themselves whenever they passed its threshold, whispering that ghosts walked there. Elias in his books, William clutching his chest, Jonathan in the orchard, Henry pale in his bed, Thomas with dagger still wet. In the midst of this ruin she walked, unhurried, her gown trailing through the halls. Around her waist hung a small pouch that clicked faintly with every step. Inside lay 5 rings, once emblems of ownership, now talismans of survival. She had not stolen them, she had claimed them. At dawn she stood in the grand hall. Light fell through shattered panes, painting the floorboards in pale bands of gold. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and endings. She opened the pouch and spilled the rings into her palm. They gleamed faintly, iron catching the first light of day. 5 bands, 5 graves, 5 men who had sworn unity through her captivity, undone one by one. A hush seemed to gather in the room as she regarded them, as though the house itself waited to hear her verdict. She closed her hand, knots tightening in her jaw. Never again. She whispered. The words were not a plea but a decree. Outside, the orchard lay white with snow. Crosses jutted from the earth in grim procession, each one marking a master's fall. Ravens perched upon the branches, silent witnesses to what had passed. The servants did not follow her when she crossed the threshold. They lowered their heads as she passed, some with reverence, others with fear. None dared touch her or question where she would go. In their eyes she was no longer a captive woman. She was vengeance made flesh, a shadow that commanded without crown or chain. She did not look back. The iron gates groaned open, and the fields stretched before her, empty rows, untended soil. Overseers vanished into silence. The estate no longer carried arrogance. It was reduced, stripped, a carcass in winter light. The road bent toward the horizon, lined with skeletal trees, and at its edge stood a figure. She paused, heart surging, as though afraid to believe. His shoulders bore the weight of labor, his garments were torn, but his eyes, those eyes she had held in memory like fire in the dark, shone the same as they had beneath moonlit fields. Chris. For a moment she thought him a vision, conjured by exhaustion, but when his voice broke across the distance, calling her name, doubt fell away. She ran to him. The pouch clutched to her chest, rattled with its burden of iron, but her arms opened at last. They met in an embrace that swallowed the years of pain, dissolving the walls and chains that had stood between them. His hands trembled as though afraid she would vanish if he let go. She pressed her forehead to his, the gesture they had once shared under starlight, wordless but profound. "You endured," he whispered, voice unsteady with grief and awe. "I endured," she answered, her tone low, steady, "and I ended them." She opened the pouch. The rings gleamed in her palm. Chris's gaze did not flinch. He saw not jewelry but gravestones, each band a death, each circle a curse transmuted into power. "These are not tokens of love," she said. "They are proof. They thought me theirs, but I carried them to their graves." He nodded, reverent. "Then you are free." Together they turned their backs on the estate. The sun climbed higher, gilding the road ahead. Step by step, they carried themselves away from the land of chains into a future unbound. Freedom pressed against her skin like a new garment, strange, heavy, exhilarating. She breathed deeply, the first breath in years that did not taste of smoke, iron, or commands. The scars remained, she knew, but scars were proof of survival, not signs of defeat. Beside her, Chris held her hand tight. She allowed herself, for the first time in years, to lean into his warmth without fear of it being torn away. Behind them, the mansion loomed, already shifting into legend. The servants whispered of curses, of rings that bled in moonlight, of the beautiful woman who had turned 5 masters into corpses. Some swore that laughter still drifted through the corridors at night, though no living master remained. Others claimed the orchard groaned when the wind passed, each tree bending over the graves as though listening to the silence beneath. Travelers, hearing these whispers, began to call it the House of Iron. They spoke of her as both curse and queen, the woman who bore 5 rings in her pouch and walked away unbroken. In time, her name blurred into rumor, but the story endured, passed from lips to lips like a warning. No pact sealed in blood and chains escapes its reckoning. The road stretched long. Winter yielded to thaw, thaw to spring. Fields blossomed green where once only sorrow grew. She walked forward, always forward, the rings at her side a reminder of what had been endured and overcome. Freedom was no gift. It had been carved by her own hands, bought with patience, cunning, and blood. And with Chris beside her, the path ahead felt bearable, even radiant, yet she knew, deep in marrow, that the rings would never wholly release her. They would clink in her sleep, whisper from her pouch, echo in her dreams. The past had ended, but its shadow would always stretch long across her future. Still, she did not falter. She had turned symbols of bondage into emblems of victory. She had ended the House of Iron, and now, at last, she walked into a story of her own making.